Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging headfirst into a conflict that, well, it's been raging for 8 decades now, often with this really surprising and intense emotional and political fervor.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing when you think about it.
It is. We're talking about the debate over water fluoridation.
Right. On the surface, it seems like such a simple, almost, mundane public works issue, just adding a compound to the public water supply to help with dental health.
Seems straightforward enough.
But as we quickly discover when we look at the source materials for this deep dive, this topic is actually one of the biggest flashpoints in the whole history of public health. It's really quite something.
Absolutely. And the rhetoric gets extreme, doesn't it? I mean, for proponents, this is seen as this foundational, almost life-saving public health measure. It's often hailed, as one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century, like a miracle intervention against widespread dental decay.
A real game changer in their view.
But then you flip the coin, and for the opponents, the language is just so much darker. We're talking about claims of compulsory mass medication, a violation of individual rights, or even, as one of our source titles actually references, a communist conspiracy.
Wow. Yeah, that level of intensity, the way it pits scientific authority against these really fundamental concerns about personal autonomy, about, water purity.
Yeah.
That's the central subject of our analysis today.
So what's the plan?
Well, our mission here is to take this stack of source materials we've got, and they really range from, detailed dental advocacy papers and U.S. court rulings all the way to historical analyses of disinformation and these conspiracy narratives, and really try to extract the key nuggets of insight.
Okay.
We want to understand the claims, obviously the counterclaims, the scientific evidence for lack thereof, and critically, the deep-seated political and psychological struggle over scientific authority that just surrounds this entire topic. It's been going on for so long.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We have sources, like you said, from the earliest dental journals right up to modern court decisions, historical conspiracy claims. What's really fascinating here, I think, is how quickly this public health goal just slams into these deeply held beliefs about individual rights.
Exactly.
It shows that the struggle isn't just about, the chemical itself. It's cognitive. It's about how we think about risk and authority.
It truly is. And to understand why fluoridation was adopted with, well, such enthusiasm in the United States and some other places, we really have to go back to the 1940s and 50s. The context back then was, frankly, pretty dire.
What exactly was the state of dental health? I mean, how bad was it?
Oh, the sources paint a picture of just widespread suffering. Dental decay, cavities were just rampant, pervasive across pretty much all socioeconomic lines. It wasn't just a poor person's problem.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of decay was apparently overwhelming the dental profession at the time. It wasn't uncommon, the sources say, for people, particularly in middle and lower income brackets, to have all their teeth removed quite early in life, like in their 30s or 40s.
All of them. Wow.
Yeah. The only reliable solution back then for mass decay was often mass extraction. Full dentures were incredibly common.
That's a really powerful and frankly kind of visceral image, isn't it? A society just actively needing a fix for a problem that was painful, disfiguring, and probably really costly too.
Precisely. And in that environment, you can see how fluoridation would have been seen as, well, a godsend. It was presented as this very attractive, incredibly cheap, that was key and definitive public health measure.
And the claimed benefits.
They were massive.
Yeah.
Transformative, really. Proponents were asserting reductions in tooth decay, typically quoted around 50 to 60%. Huge numbers.
50 to 60%, that's enormous.
Enormous. And the associated health risks were deemed pretty much negligible. They were confined almost entirely to something called cosmetic modeling or dental fluorosis, which in its mild form is just, minor white flecks on the teeth. Barely noticeable sometimes.
So the pitch was basically a near-perfect solution.
Yeah.
Huge benefit, tiny cost, minimal risk.
That was exactly the framing. High benefit, low cost, low risk. And crucially, it was delivered without requiring any individual action, right?
Right, that's a big plus for public health measures.
You don't have to remember to take a pill or brush differently. It just happens when you drink the water. Passive delivery. Very appealing from a public health perspective.
But, okay, the moment you start adding chemicals, any chemical, to a public utility like water, critics are inevitably going to pop up and ask, is this natural? Is this really safe? How did the proponents handle that sort of fundamental philosophical objection?
Well, they employed a very clever rhetorical strategy, actually. Instead of defending it purely as an artificial medical intervention, which sounds a bit in truth.
Scary, yeah.
Yeah. Right. They framed it as a correction to an already artificial situation. Proponents argued that fluoridation is simply replicating a natural process, the process that occurs in groundwater when it passes through fluoride-rich rock formations naturally.
Ah, okay, so they position naturally occurring fluoride as the sort of gold standard, the baseline.
Exactly. They suggested that these large-scale urban water systems, the reservoirs, the pipes, the dams, pulling water from sometimes distant sources, those are the artificial constructs. The water in those reservoirs might be deficient in fluoride compared to, say, the natural streams and wells people historically drank from, which were enriched by local soil minerals.
So adding fluoride isn't polluting, it's restoring.
That was the argument. Fluoridation was merely topping up the supply to restore it to its healthy, natural state. This reframing, moving from adding something potentially unnatural or harmful to restoring something inherently beneficial, that was absolutely key to selling the concept to the public and to policymakers.
That's quite a shift in perspective. But as you said, that reframing might have helped. But our sources make it really clear that the opposition was definitely not quiet. Despite this strong public health justification, resistance popped up almost immediately back in the 1940s and has remained incredibly persistent ever since.
It really has. The data actually shows a bit of a paradox. While fluoridation did expand greatly across the U.S. population, especially in the 1950s.
Right, that initial push.
Yeah, that initial wave was strong. But the rate of increase slowed considerably later on. And today, it still hovers at only about half of the U.S. population served by water systems with added fluoride. And it's even less common globally, especially in Europe.
So the opposition, while maybe not stopping it everywhere, certainly put the brakes on its universal adoption.
Absolutely. They were vocal and consistent right from the very beginning.
Okay, let's delve into those core opposition claims then, particularly the ethical arguments, because I think that's where the debate really elevates beyond just, dentistry and cavities.
Agreed. The central ethical challenge, and it's the one that gets deployed and debated most frequently even today, is this concept of compulsory mass medication.
Right. That phrase comes up again and again.
It does. Opponents argue that fluoride, when added to water for health purposes, is essentially a drug. And forcing an uncontrolled individual dosage onto the entire public without their specific consent is unethical and unacceptable.
Why do they put so much stress on the uncontrolled individual dosage part?
Well, because your actual exposure, the amount of fluoride you ingest, is entirely dependent on your personal consumption habits. How much water do you drink?
Makes sense.
A construction worker out in the heat all day, or an athlete, might drink, say, 4 liters of water. They're getting a far, far greater dose than maybe an elderly person who only drinks 1 glass a day, or a baby drinking formula mixed with tap water.
So there's no way to tailor the dose to the individual.
None whatsoever through the water supply. And opponents argue, look, if this were a prescription drug for a potentially fatal illness, maybe that lack of dosage control could be debated or tolerated. But for a non-lethal condition like dental decay, forcing the ingestion of an uncontrolled substance is seen as a fundamental, unacceptable violation of bodily autonomy.
And that argument ties directly into this very basic concept of water purity, doesn't it? And individual rights over what goes into your body.
Exactly. It taps into that feeling. If the water is made impure because a chemical, a medication has been added without your choice, then it becomes a matter of government overreach, of the state intruding into your personal health decisions and your body.
That's a powerful ethical core. And then, beyond the ethics, what about the direct health claims the opponents were making?
Well, alongside the ethical arguments, opponents consistently argued that the benefits were, frankly, overrated or exaggerated. And more pointedly, they raised concerns about possible adverse health consequences that went far beyond just cosmetic modeling of the teeth.
What kind of consequences?
Specifically, they raised concerns early on about things like skeletal fluorosis, various intolerance reactions, and most alarmingly, cancer.
Okay, we should probably pause on those specific health scares for a second. Skeletal fluorosis and intolerance reactions, they sound, well, abstract, but also quite frightening. What are they exactly?
Skeletal fluorosis is essentially the severe, debilitating end of chronic fluoride poisoning. It involves the accumulation of fluoride in the bones over many, many years, decades even. This can lead to things like joint pain, stiffness, and in very severe cases, calcification of ligaments and eventually crippling immobility.
Is that common at the levels used in water fluoridation?
No, it's generally considered rare. The typical U.S. fluoridation levels are around zero point 0.7 parts per million.
Mm.
But it is a massive public health problem in other parts of the world, like India or China, where natural fluoride concentrations in groundwater can be extremely high, sometimes 10 or 20 times higher than artificial fluoridation levels. So the condition itself is very real.
Okay, and the intolerance reactions.
Those are less well-defined, but opponents claim they involve a wide range of symptoms. Things like headaches, stomach problems, skin rashes, maybe even neurological issues like fatigue or difficulty concentrating. They attribute these to a sort of hypersensitivity to the fluoride compound, even at the low levels found in tap water. These are much harder to study scientifically, of course.
Right, sounds very subjective. But the moment you introduce the possibility of cancer or a debilitating bone disease, even if it's rare or linked to much higher doses, you completely change the emotional temperature of the debate. You move it from preventing a nuisance like cavities to invoking mortal fear.
Absolutely. And that fear is precisely what fuels the political dimension of this fight. It's really fascinating that this issue has so strongly resisted resolution through just scientific consensus alone, which strongly suggests the conflict is, at its heart, essentially political, not just scientific.
Do the sources confirm that it's politics blocking wider adoption?
Yes. Interestingly, the sources highlight that even some proponents of fluoridation admit that the lack of global adoption, for instance, the fact that most Western European countries do not fluoridate their water, often has very little to do with the actual science itself.
So what is it then, if not the science?
Well, one proponent is quoted quite bluntly as saying, it has nothing to do with science, it's all politics. The factors cited for non-adoption elsewhere often include things like legal obstacles, maybe strict water purity laws in some nations that make adding anything difficult, or just strong popular opposition to what's perceived as centralized, paternalistic public health measures.
Is there a historical element to that resistance in some places?
Sometimes, yeah. The opposition is sometimes linked, particularly in Europe, to historical experiences with authoritarianism or fascism, where any kind of mass government mandate, especially one involving ingestion, triggers deep-seated distrust. It demonstrates how effectively organized groups of anti-fluoridationists, often working at the local grassroots level, can successfully leverage that political distrust and those ethical arguments to block implementation, often regardless of what the mainstream scientific bodies are saying.
Okay, this takes us really directly into part two then. Dissecting the evidence itself and looking at how these scientific disputes get tangled up with and sometimes weaponized into broader conspiracy narratives. If those core scientific arguments for the huge 50–60% reduction are maybe harder to pin down today, we need to understand why.
That's definitely where the data starts to get a bit murky, or at least more complex. Critics, especially in recent decades, note that those massive decay reductions that were originally attributed solely to water fluoridation are becoming increasingly difficult.
And is that change in the attributable effect simply because other things have improved? Like,
Yeah.
it's a consequence of success elsewhere in dental care.
That's precisely the argument. Because of the now widespread availability of other fluoride products, fluoride toothpaste is ubiquitous, fluoride mouthwashes, professional fluoride treatments at the dentist. Almost everyone, at least in developed countries, is now receiving some level of both systemic and topical fluoride exposure anyway.
So the baseline has shifted.
Exactly. When the background level of dental health improves universally because of these other factors, the incremental effect that you can specifically attribute just to the tiny amount of fluoride in the water supply, well, it naturally declines. It gets harder to measure against that improved baseline.
So the original data from the 1950s might have been perfectly accurate for that time, but it's just less relevant today in a high-resource environment where everyone's using fluoride toothpaste.
That's the complex reality proponents have to grapple with now. However, it's really important, and the sources are careful to point this out, that this decline in the measurable effect isn't necessarily universal across all populations.
Yeah.
Meaning that underprivileged communities, people who may not have regular access to dental care, maybe can't afford fluoride toothpaste consistently or don't get supplemental fluoride drops for their kids. They might still see the most significant and quantifiable benefit from mandatory water fluoridation.
Ah, so for them, the water supply might still be the most reliable and equitable source of fluoride exposure?
It could be. And that creates a really difficult public health policy dilemma, doesn't it? You're debating whether to continue or implement a measure that might offer only minimal additional benefit to the relatively well-off majority, but could still provide essential protective benefits to the most marginalized groups.
That definitely makes the policy decision incredibly complicated. It's not a simple yes or no based on the average effect.
Not at all. Now let's go back to the foundational research. The studies that were used to launch fluoridation in the first place, those original trials in places like Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Newburgh, New York. Critics, most notably an Australian dental statistician named Philip Sutton back in the 50s and 60s, really scrutinized those central papers, and they argued, quite forcefully, that there were significant methodological flaws.
Okay, and the key concern, the one that gets mentioned a lot, was something called examiner bias. Now, that sounds like a very technical academic concept, but it seems like it could have profound real-world consequences for those big benefit claims. Can you break down what that bias actually means in a dental study?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital to understanding the doubts about those original claims. The original studies required dental examiners, usually dentists or trained dental hygienists, to physically go into schools and visually inspect children's teeth. They'd use a little mirror and a sharp metal probe called an explorer.
Right, I remember those from the dentist.
Exactly. And they would count the number of decayed, missing, and filled tooth surfaces. That gives you the DMF score, which is the standard measure of dental decay experience.
Okay. So what was the bias?
The critical issue was that in these early key studies, the examiners were not blinded, meaning they knew whether the child they were currently examining came from the town that had fluoridated water or from the control town that did not have fluoridated water.
Ah. So, knowing the expected outcome that the kids in the fluoridated town should have better teeth could unconsciously color their judgment when they were making the assessment.
That's precisely the concern. Think about it. Determining whether a tiny pit or fissure on the surface of a tooth is just a harmless stain, or maybe an incipient lesion, or if it's actually a cavity that needs a filling, that involves a distinct subjective evaluative element.
It's not always black and white.
Not always, especially with very early decay. The dentist uses that sharp probe. If the probe tip sort of catches or sticks slightly in a spot that feels a bit soft or decalcified, it's usually classified as a cavity. Sutton argued that the examiner's preconception, maybe even a subconscious desire for the experiment to succeed, for fluoridation to be proven effective, could lead them to be perhaps slightly less rigorous, maybe a little less likely to probe quite as deeply, or just generally more lenient in their classification of borderline lesions in the kids from the fluoridated group compared to the kids in the control group.
So, even without any outright intentional fraud, the difference between, say, a 60% reported reduction and maybe a 40% actual reduction might come down to just the enthusiasm or the expectations of the dentist doing the exam.
That is the absolute core of Sutton's critique. This kind of methodological argument, focusing on the inherent difficulty of maintaining perfect objectivity in subjective clinical evaluations, especially when the examiner isn't blinded, casts significant doubt on the truly massive benefit claims cited in those crucial early days. And it provided opponents with a powerful, data-driven counterargument that they've used ever since.
That makes sense. And beyond those intentional trials, you mentioned critics also challenged the early attempts to use data from places that had naturally high levels of fluoride in their water.
Yes, this is another key detail in the critique of the early evidence. Critics argued that drawing ironclad conclusions from just observing communities that happen to have naturally fluoridated water places, like certain towns in Texas or Colorado, for example, was problematic.
Why? What was the issue there?
The issue is that those natural water sources often had high levels of other minerals besides fluoride, things like calcium, magnesium, strontium, boron, and others. They pointed out that water that is naturally high in minerals is generally harder water.
Okay, what's the potential implication of hard water versus soft water in this context?
Well, it raises the possibility of confounding variables. Maybe the overall high mineral content of this hard water was contributing to the observed lower rates of tooth decay, not solely the fluoride itself. Perhaps the combination of calcium and magnesium, for instance, was strengthening tooth enamel in a way that fluoride alone wouldn't. Or maybe the water simply tasted different, which might affect consumption patterns or dietary habits in those communities.
So you can't be sure you're isolating the effect of just the fluoride.
Exactly. If you can't fully disentangle the specific effect of fluoride from the potential effects of all these other naturally co-occurring minerals in those locations, how can you be absolutely certain that you'll get the exact same result when you artificially add only a fluoride compound, like sodium fluoride or fluorosilicic acid, to naturally soft water that lacks those other minerals? This complexity, this potential for confounding, just feeds the cycle of doubt and debate about the true isolated benefit.
Okay. Now, let's shift gears slightly and address probably the most dramatic and certainly the most attention-grabbing claim made by opponents over the years, the comparison of fluoride to rat poison.
Right. It's a highly effective, highly emotional comparison. And it is, as our sources note, technically correct in a specific context, which is why we have to acknowledge it and discuss it.
Technically correct how?
Well, fluoride compounds, particularly sodium fluoride, in high concentrations, are indeed used as active ingredients in some pesticides, including rodenticides. That
Yeah.
is a factual statement.
Okay.
An opponent seizes on this fact immediately, of course. It forces a discussion about safety and toxicity, even at the vastly lower parts per million level used in water fluoridation. It plants that seed of doubt. If it's used to kill rats, can it possibly be safe for humans, especially children, to drink every single day?
It's a powerful piece of rhetoric, even if the dosage is completely different.
Extremely powerful. And the debate around safety has really moved far beyond just the cosmetic modeling concerns of the early days. Now, the focus of opponents is much more on potential long-term systemic toxicity, particularly alleged effects on the brain and bones.
And this leads us directly to what you mentioned earlier, perhaps the most significant recent legal development in this whole saga, the IQ controversy. Can you tell us more about that California court case?
Yes, this was a really major case. It was brought by the Fluoride Action Network, usually known as FAN.
They're a prominent anti-fluoridation group.
Yes, probably the most prominent and organized anti-fluoridation advocacy group in the U.S. They focus on legal challenges, disseminating scientific critiques, and lobbying against fluoridation policies. They brought this lawsuit against the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA.
And what was their argument?
They argued that the EPA's current standard for fluoride in drinking water, specifically the recommended optimal level of 0.7 milligrams per liter or zero point 0.7 ppm, was unsafe and posed an unreasonable risk, particularly to the developing brains of children. They were asking the court to force the EPA to regulate fluoride more stringently under the Toxic Substances Control Act.
Okay, and the ruling itself was pretty striking, wasn't it?
It really was. After years of litigation and reviewing extensive scientific evidence presented by both sides, the U.S. District Judge, Edward M. Chen, issued a finding, not yet a final remedy order, but a finding on the evidence. He concluded that fluoridation at the currently recommended U.S. level does pose an unreasonable risk of reduced IQ in children.
Wow. An unreasonable risk of reduced IQ. That's a huge statement from a federal judge. What was that based on?
It wasn't based on just one single study. It was largely based on his assessment of the totality of the evidence, including a significant number of epidemiological studies, many of them conducted internationally in places like China, Mexico, India, Canada, often in areas with varying levels of natural fluoride in the water. He also considered animal studies and mechanistic studies. Judge Chen essentially found that the body of evidence showing an association between elevated fluoride exposure, even at levels overlapping with those from artificial fluoridation, and lowered IQ scores in children, was strong enough to meet the legal standard of unreasonable risk.
That's an incredibly powerful conclusion for a sitting U.S. judge to reach, especially regarding such a widely supported, long-standing public health measure. Did he offer any insight into his level of conviction about that data?
Yes, in his written findings, he added that, in his view, there is significant certainty in the data set regarding the association between fluoride and reduced IQ. Now, the EPA strongly disagrees with this assessment of the evidence, and the case is still technically ongoing regarding the final remedy.
But the finding itself stands.
The finding itself was a major victory for FNN and a significant blow to fluoridation proponents. It legally validates, at least in this one court's view, one of the most serious claims made by anti-fluoridationists. It really shifts the burden of proof and suggests that the balance of perceived risk versus benefit might be changing, or at least is being seriously questioned, based on newer research. It forces government agencies and public health bodies to address these concerns about potential neurotoxicity in a way that goes far beyond just dental health.
And this whole issue of toxicity, particularly serious systemic toxicity, it isn't new, is it? Going way back to the 1970s, the health argument often pivoted around cancer, which is arguably an even more culturally significant dread disease than potential IQ effects.
Indeed it did. Back in the mid-1970s, a biochemist named Dr. John Yamuyanis, who later became a leading figure in the anti-fluoridation movement, published work, often in collaboration with Dr. Dean Burke, a former senior chemist at the National Cancer Institute.
An NCI chemist, that lends some credibility.
It certainly did initially. They argued, based on their analysis of cancer mortality statistics in fluoridated versus unfluoridated cities in the U.S., that fluoridation was associated with increased cancer death rates. Specifically, they claimed about a 5–10% increase.
That would be a massive public health disaster if true.
Absolutely. This was a particularly potent challenge because, as you said, cancer symbolizes this hidden, insidious, and often catastrophic health failure. It taps into very deep fears.
And Yamuyanis and Burke, they faced intense pushback for these claims, correct?
Oh, immediately and fiercely. Their claims were subjected to intense scrutiny, multiple reanalyses by government agencies and other researchers, which disputed their findings and methodology, and repeated personal attacks on their credibility and competence. The debate very quickly deteriorated into accusations of flawed science and statistical manipulation on one side, and accusations of cover-up and conspiracy on the other.
So it really established a template, didn't it, for how these fluoride debates would be conducted for decades to come, not just challenging the data, but often resorting to attacking the individuals who present inconvenient data.
Exactly. It set the stage for a highly polarized, often vitriolic debate where questioning the science could lead to professional ostracization.
And this intensity, this willingness to believe the worst, brings us inevitably to the truly dramatic and often, frankly, baseless conspiracy theories that have swirled around fluoride. How did opponents manage to connect adding fluoride to water with these grand ideas of deliberate societal control, even invoking, incredibly, the Nazis and communists?
All right, these theories, while lacking any credible historical foundation, are absolutely crucial to understand because they illustrate the profound level of institutional distrust that fluoridation can provoke in some people. The source material notes that these narratives are often circulated, maybe in letters to the editor, online forums, or through activist networks, by readers or advocates who seem willing to seize on almost any means to discredit government authority.
So what's the specific claim about the Nazis?
One widely circulated claim, which our source material mentions being cited by a reader, quoting Dr. Kevin Galley, is that fluoride was deliberately used by the Nazis on Jewish prisoners in concentration camps. The alleged purpose was to dull their brains and make them more docile and easier to control.
And what about the Japanese connection that's sometimes mentioned?
The same cluster of theories sometimes alleges that fluoride was subsequently used on the Japanese population after their surrender following World War II. Again, the purported intent was to somehow dull their resistance or make them more compliant. There's even a bizarre add-on to this claim sometimes, pointing out, spuriously, that Japan is supposedly the only major Asian nation that didn't experience a significant post-war baby boom, with the implication being that fluoride caused some lasting systemic effect, maybe brain dulling or even reproductive harm.
Now, it is absolutely essential here, and we need to stress this for our listeners, that we are impartially reporting that these claims exist within the public debate and are found in the source materials analyzing the controversy. We are not in any way endorsing them as historical fact.
Absolutely critical distinction.
Yes. In fact, organizations like PolitiFact and numerous historical investigations have thoroughly debunked the specific Nazi fluoride connection. They've noted that while the Nazis certainly engaged in horrific and inhumane medical experiments, the idea that fluoride was used as a mass mind control agent in concentration camps appears to be a baseless fabrication, likely originating much later, possibly in the early anti-fluoridation movement or even more recently online.
That distinction is crucial. But the existence of the theory and its persistent appeal to a certain segment of the opposition tells us everything we need to know about the willingness of some people to believe the absolute worst about centralized authority and hidden motives. The core message, whether it involves Nazis or communists or some other shadowy group, is always the same. The government or some powerful entity is intentionally poisoning us to gain control.
Which leads naturally to the next point, the dueling narratives about who is really benefiting from fluoridation, the whole question of vested interests. How do the two sides typically characterize each other's financial and political support structures?
It's a classic case of narrative warfare. Proponents, naturally, frame their support base as entirely legitimate, morally sound, and institutionally responsible. They point to endorsements from the mainstream dental profession, primarily the American Dental Association, ADA, public health officials like the U.S. Public Health Service, USPHS, and respected civic groups like the Chamber of Commerce, parent-teacher associations, PTAs, and so on.
The establishment, basically.
Right. Science, medicine, civic responsibility. And conversely, they often characterize their opponents as being ideologically fringe or motivated by unscientific beliefs. Common labels thrown at opponents include the politically ultra-conservative John Birch Society, which was prominent in early anti-fluoridation campaigns, health food enthusiasts, chiropractors, who often hold alternative health views, and Christian Scientists. The implication is that these are people operating outside the accepted mainstream of science and rational civic life.
So that's a pretty effective narrative. You've got science and responsible civic groups on one side versus radical fringe beliefs on the other.
It is effective. But the opponents, of course, completely flip that script. They argue that the real vested interests, the hidden powers pulling the strings behind fluoridation, are actually huge industrial corporations.
Which ones?
Specifically, they often point to the aluminum industry and the phosphate fertilizer industry. Why? Because fluoride, specifically compounds like silica fluorides, can be a significant industrial byproduct or waste product from these manufacturing processes.
Ah, so the claim is that these industries needed a cheap way to get rid of this waste.
Exactly. The opponent's narrative is that these powerful industries saw water fluoridation as an incredibly convenient, even profitable way to dispose of what they frame as a dangerous industrial pollutant. Instead of paying potentially high costs for safe disposal, they could sell it to municipalities to dump into the public water supply under the guise of public health.
And the government agencies.
In this narrative, government bureaucracies like the USPHS aren't acting independently for public good. They're simply imposing the will of these corporate elites, either because they're naive or co-opted or part of the same power structure.
So in the opponent's story, they are the ordinary, concerned members of the community, the grassroots defenders trying to protect the purity of the water, and their efforts are being suppressed by this powerful, hidden collusion between big industry and big government. The argument becomes about corporate corruption versus community defense.
Precisely. And this fundamental struggle over who is credible, who is trustworthy, and who is acting in good faith that becomes the real battleground. It extends far, far beyond just debating parts per million or DMF scores. It's why we really need to shift our focus now to how this ideological battle actually plays out on the ground, often through intense local power struggles and sometimes even personal vendettas against scientists who dare to dissent.
Okay, the New Orleans case study from the 1950s, which is detailed in one of our sources, seems like an excellent, very specific example of that kind of cautious local resistance playing out.
It really does. Remember, this is the era, the early 1950s, right after the initial studies came out, when many U.S. cities were adopting fluoridation quite rapidly, often with strong backing from federal health authorities. But in New Orleans, the story was different. Specifically, the body responsible for the city's water, the Sewerage and Water Board, showed remarkable caution between 1951 and 1957.
They didn't just jump on board.
No. In fact, in 1952, the board explicitly declined to either endorse or reject fluoridation. They issued a statement saying that the matter was, and this is a direct quote, of such great import to the health of the people that they felt they should wait.
Wait for what exactly? More studies.
Essentially, yes. They stated they would wait until, quote, all the scientists in this field will have had an opportunity to assemble their experiments and will have reached the definite conclusion that the addition of fluorine-6 to the public water is a safe and harmless procedure.
Wow. That's a remarkably high bar they set there, demanding a definite conclusion of safe and harmless from all the scientists.
It's an incredibly high bar. Because in any area of controversial science, especially involving population-wide exposures, achieving that level of absolute, unambiguous certainty and universal consensus, well, it rarely, if ever, actually arrives. There are always lingering questions, dissenting views, areas for more research.
So their demand for absolute certainty basically acted as a major roadblock to implementation in New Orleans at the time.
It did. And this local resistance, this cautious stance by the water board, was significantly bolstered by the involvement of a very high-profile figure in the city, a Dr. Alton Ochsner.
Who was he?
Dr. Ochsner was a highly respected surgeon, internationally known, a founder of the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, a major medical figure, very influential. And initially, like many physicians, he actually favored fluoridation. He saw through the standard lens of a potentially beneficial public health measure.
But then he changed his mind.
Dramatically. Around 1955, according to the sources, he completely reversed his opinion after receiving information, particularly regarding potential toxicity, from a colleague, a Dr. C.C. Bass, who was a former dean of Tulane Medical School and also a fluoride skeptic. Ochsner became a very prominent and vocal opponent of fluoridation in New Orleans.
That kind of sudden reversal by such a prominent, respected medical authority must have had immense local power and influence on the debate.
Absolutely. It gave significant weight and credibility to the opposition's arguments.
Now, our sources suggest there might be another layer to this story, perhaps a deeply personal, even tragic reason that could help explain why Dr. Oxner might have shifted away from supporting widespread, government-mandated preventative health measures around that specific time.
Yes, the sources draw a potential, though obviously speculative, connection between Ochsner's reversal on fluoridation and a devastating national public health crisis that unfolded in that exact same year, 1955, the Cutter Laboratories polio vaccine debacle.
Ah, the incident where some batches of the Salk vaccine accidentally contained live polio virus.
Exactly. And tragically, Dr. Ochsner had a direct, devastating personal connection to this event. His first grandchild, a little boy named Eugene Allen Davis Jr., who was only 2.5 years old.
Oh no, what happened?
In April 1955, the child was inoculated with a batch of the Salk polio vaccine that had been produced by Cutter Laboratories in California. Unfortunately, this specific batch was one of the relatively few that, due to failures in the manufacturing and safety testing process, still contained live virulent poliovirus instead of just the inactivated virus.
So the vaccine itself gave him polio.
Yes. Ochsner's grandchild contracted paralytic polio as a direct result of the vaccination. And tragically, he died just a few weeks later on May 4, 1955. This was part of a larger outbreak caused by the Cutter vaccine, which infected about 40,000 children, caused dozens of cases of paralysis, and several deaths. It was a catastrophic failure of what was intended to be a mass, life-saving, centrally coordinated public health measure.
An unimaginable tragedy for any family, let alone a prominent physician who likely championed the vaccine initially. Seeing a public health triumph turn into a lethal risk right within your own family, that must have fundamentally altered his perspective on government-sponsored mandatory prevention programs.
Psychologically, it's hard to imagine it wouldn't have. For Ochsner, the perceived risk of systemic harm lurking within a seemingly safe, universally recommended government-mandated preventative measure suddenly became terrifyingly, devastatingly, personally real. It provides a crucial, though perhaps subconscious, lens through which to understand why he might have developed such a deep distrust of adding anything, even something like fluoride with claimed benefits, to the public water supply without absolute, unimpeachable certainty of its safety.
It suggests his policy reversal wasn't just about the specific scientific data on fluoride he received from Dr. Bass. It might also have been rooted in this profound personal trauma and a fundamental questioning of institutional infallibility when it comes to mass health interventions.
It's a plausible contributing factor, certainly. And this kind of deep institutional distrust was undoubtedly amplified over the years by the ways the major public health bodies and professional organizations chose to engage with, or rather chose to treat, dissenting scientists who questioned fluoridation. Let's talk about the campaign that was apparently waged to discredit Dr. George Waldbot. Ah, yes, Dr. Waldbot. He was a physician, an allergist actually, based in Michigan, who became known starting in the 1950s for researching fluoride toxicity. He published papers and a book documenting cases of what he believed were adverse reactions to fluoridated water, including the kinds of intolerance symptoms we discussed earlier.
So he was directly challenging the safety claims. How did the establishment respond?
Well, rather than primarily engaging with his scientific papers through rigorous debate in the open scientific literature, which is, the standard scientific process of critique and counter-critique.
The way it's supposed to work.
Right. Instead, the sources describe how proponents, reportedly with heavy support and encouragement from the U.S. Public Health Service, USPHS, and the American Dental Association, ADA, chose to wage what looks very much like a campaign of personal discrediting against him.
How did they manage to bypass the scientific method, so to speak, and focus the attack on the individual researcher?
The key event, according to the sources analyzing this history, was something called the Hornung incident. It seems Waldbot made a critical tactical mistake, perhaps born of naivete about the political nature of the debate. He actually allowed a known, dedicated pro-fluoridationist dentist named H.V. Hornung, who was also a local health official, access to his private patient files.
He just let him see his confidential patient records. Why would he do that?
Apparently, Waldbot was operating under the assumption that a fellow health professional, even one on the other side of the issue, would examine the files scientifically and objectively. He's quoted later as saying something like, "The thought would never have crossed my mind that a health official's motives could be political rather than scientific." He expected a scientific review.
But Hornung didn't use the access that way.
Not according to this account. Hornung subsequently wrote a highly critical, even scathing account based on his review of Waldbot's files. His critique, rather than focusing purely on the scientific interpretation of the data, reportedly questioned Waldbot's diagnostic methods, the thoroughness of his investigations, and generally suggested that his published claims of fluoride toxicity lacked proper scientific rigor and were perhaps based on misdiagnosis or inadequate workups. It essentially questioned Waldbot's competence and potentially his motivations, rather than just his data.
Okay, so Hornan writes this critical report. How did the ADA and USPHS use it?
They apparently amplified it exponentially. Hornung's critical account was published prominently in the Journal of the American Dental Association, JADA, the main, widely read journal of the dental profession. But critically, the ADA didn't stop there. They then allegedly issued a nationwide news release summarizing Hornung's critique and heavily utilized the JDA article in correspondence and public statements whenever Waldbot's name or research came up. They sent reprints of it out widely.
So the strategic goal seems clear. Shift the entire focus away from the actual substance of Waldbot's findings, the possibility of fluoride toxicity, and onto the alleged incompetence or questionable behavior of the critic himself.
Exactly. It becomes a classic case study in how character assassination can sometimes substitute for genuine scientific debate, especially when powerful institutions feel threatened.
And was this campaign successful in marginalizing Waldbot?
The sources suggest it was incredibly successful. The sustained campaign, amplified through official channels like JD and ADA press releases, ensured that Waldbot was effectively discredited in the eyes of most mainstream practicing dentists and physicians. It led to the situation where, even today, his research findings on fluoride intolerance or toxicity are very seldom mentioned or cited in official reviews or position statements by fluoridation supporters. They essentially managed to remove him and his line of inquiry from the mainstream conversation.
It's a chilling example, and we see this pattern, this apparent suppression of dissent, repeated internationally too, right? When other critics tried to raise methodological flaws in epidemiological data from other countries.
Yes, absolutely. The sources detail similar experiences faced by critics in places like New Zealand. For instance, researchers like Dr. Mark Diesendorf and Dr. John Colquhoun published critiques in the scientific literature pointing out what they saw as flaws or inconsistencies in studies that have been used to claim massive decay reductions from fluoridation in New Zealand.
And how was their work received by health authorities there?
Well, according to the accounts, their published work was met with some highly irregular tactics. For example, a senior dental health official in New Zealand, Peter Hunter, reportedly wrote detailed critical letters alleging scientific mistakes or misinterpretations in Colquhoun's and Diesendorf's analyses. But instead of submitting these critiques as formal letters to the editor of the scientific journals where the original papers appeared, which would allow for a public reply.
The normal scientific process again.
Right. Instead, Hunter allegedly circulated these internal critical dossiers widely to local water supply authorities, government health committees, and even the media within New Zealand. But critically, he reportedly did not always send a copy of the critique directly to Colquhoun or Diesendorf themselves.
Wait, so they couldn't even respond? That seems like a fundamental denial of due process, even in a scientific context. If you don't officially receive the critique, you can't formulate and publish an official response to it in the public scientific sphere.
Precisely. It makes formal replies extremely difficult, if not impossible. This alleged tactic of circulating critical dossiers internally, using official letterheads and channels to discredit a researcher's work among policymakers and the public, without subjecting the critique itself to open peer review or allowing the target a chance to respond publicly, speaks volumes about how scientific controversy can intersect with raw institutional power.
It suggests that if you control the professional bodies, the internal circulation channels, the flow of information to decision makers, you can effectively marginalize or even silence dissent and maintain the appearance of consensus without ever having to engage in a truly open, transparent debate on the scientific merits in the peer-reviewed literature.
That's the concern raised by these accounts, yes. It becomes a form of gatekeeping or information control.
And as our sources also describe, the strategy wasn't just limited to detailed critiques of specific papers. It apparently included broader campaigns just to belittle the credibility of all opposition figures, often by association.
Absolutely. There are accounts suggesting that partisan groups supporting fluoridation, perhaps working with or encouraged by health agencies, compiled and circulated what were essentially dossiers of derogatory comments about their opponents.
What kind of comments were they about their science?
Not primarily, no. According to these descriptions, the focus wasn't usually on refuting their scientific findings point by point. Instead, the dossiers often focused on personal characteristics, affiliations, or unrelated past issues. They might list individuals known to oppose fluoridation and then detail, perhaps, that some had been convicted of unrelated crimes or had spent time as mental hospital patients or belonged to groups deemed politically extremist.
The Ku Klux Klan example comes up.
Yes, that's a notorious example often cited. Proponents made sure to repeatedly mention that groups like the Ku Klux Klan oppose fluoridation. The clear implication being, if you oppose fluoridation, you're aligning yourself with these despicable groups.
That's pure ad hominem attack, isn't it? Trying to discredit an argument by associating the people making it with politically unacceptable groups or individuals with unrelated personal failings, regardless of the actual merits of their scientific or ethical points about fluoride.
It's a transparent and often effective attempt to inject fear, shame, and social pressure into the discussion. It aims to scare respectable people, doctors, dentists, community leaders, ordinary citizens, away from even considering the opposition's arguments, let alone voicing support for them.
It essentially frames the choice as starkly binary. You are either with the respectable mainstream represented by the USPHS and the ADA, or you are throwing your lot in with criminals, extremists, and the mentally unstable.
Precisely. And this tells us far less about the science of fluoride and far more about the fundamental human psychology of belief, tribalism, and the defense of authority.
Which is exactly where we need to pivot next. After digging into all this history, the claims, the counterclaims, the tactics, what does this deep dive into the fluoridation conflict really teach us about how the human brain operates when faced with these kinds of highly charged, complex public health issues?
Oh, it's almost a perfect real-world textbook case for analyzing cognitive biases in action. We can use concepts like cognitive dissonance, that mental discomfort we feel when we hold two conflicting beliefs or ideas simultaneously, to understand why partisans on both sides often cling so fiercely to their views, even in the face of contrary evidence.
Okay, let's apply that concept specifically. How might cognitive dissonance play out for proponents, say, the public health officials or the dentists who've championed fluoridation for years? What's their internal conflict?
Well, their core self-concept is likely something like, I am a rational, responsible public health professional or dentist committed to the welfare of the public based on the best available science.
Yeah.
That's a positive, important part of their identity.
Right.
Now, imagine they encounter credible-seeming evidence suggesting that the public health measure they've long championed might actually carry some risks they hadn't fully appreciated, perhaps related to skeletal health, or maybe even low-level neurotoxicity concerns like the IQ data, or the undeniable reality of widespread dental sclerosis, which isn't just cosmetic to everyone. That creates dissonance. It conflicts with their self-image as protectors of public health.
So how do they resolve that uncomfortable feeling?
To resolve that mental discomfort and maintain their positive self-concept, they might engage in motivated reasoning. They might dismiss the contrary evidence by labeling the sources as fringe or unreliable. Oh, that's just FAN, or that study was done in China, it doesn't apply here. Or they might attack the credibility of the researchers. Walbot was incompetent, Yamoyanis used flawed statistics. Or they might overemphasize the benefits and minimize the risks. All of these strategies help reduce the dissonance and allow them to continue believing they are acting responsibly.
Okay, and what about for the opponents? They presumably experience dissonance too, and have the same basic need for self-justification.
Absolutely. Their self-concept might be something like, I am an informed, concerned, perhaps scientifically literate citizen fighting for truth, purity, and individual freedom against a potentially harmful government mandate.
Yeah.
That's their identity in this fight.
And the conflicting idea.
The conflicting idea is the overwhelming reality that the vast majority of the mainstream scientific and dental organizations worldwide, the ADA, the CDC, the WHO, countless national health bodies, consider their reviews to be incorrect, unscientific, maybe even paranoid, or based on conspiracy theories. That's a tough reality to reconcile with being an informed truth teller.
So how do they resolve that dissonance?
They resolve it by rejecting the mainstream consensus entirely. They might embrace explanations like, the consensus is manufactured, it's bought and paid for by corporate interests like the aluminum industry, or the authorities are engaged in a deliberate cover-up. By believing this, they can dismiss the conflicting evidence from mainstream sources and maintain their self-concept as the brave, lone defenders of the truth against a corrupt system. It justifies their continued opposition.
So it really becomes confirmation bias writ large on both sides. We naturally seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, our core identity, and our mission in the world.
Absolutely. Genuine scientific thinking is actually inherently unnatural in some ways because it requires us to actively seek out evidence that could potentially disconfirm our cherished hypotheses or beliefs. That's hard work. The human brain, especially when dealing with complex, emotionally charged issues that touch on our values and identity, is just not naturally wired to do that easily. It's much more naturally wired for tribal justification and belief defense.
And when we move these kinds of scientifically complex but emotionally charged issues into the political arena, like deciding whether to fluoridate a city's water supply, our sources suggest that any semblance of dispassionate, rational weighing of evidence just goes out the window entirely.
That's essentially the core thesis, derived from sources discussing works like Drew Weston's The Political Brain. The traditional Enlightenment view of the human mind as, a kind of impartial judge coolly weighing evidence to arrive at a rational conclusion. It just seems to collapse when faced with political questions, especially ones with moral or tribal dimensions, like control over the public water supply.
So what takes over, if not reason?
Emotions take the driver's seat. Our emotional agendas, whether that's a deep-seated fear of contamination and government coercion, or the powerful moral certainty of providing a public health benefit to children. Those underlying emotions seem to determine what evidence we actually find persuasive, which arguments resonate with us, and critically, which sources we deem credible and trustworthy.
So the debate stops being primarily about the objective weight of evidence regarding milligrams of fluoride or statistical significance in studies, and it starts being fundamentally about who we trust and which emotional narrative feels right to us.
Precisely. And partisans on both sides become very adept at leveraging emotion. Proponents appeal to the positive emotions of safety, progress, scientific authority, and civic responsibility. It's a smart thing to do for our kids. Opponents, conversely, are often highly effective at leveraging negative emotions. Fear of hidden poison, moral outrage over government coercion and lack of consent, and deep distrust of centralized power and corporate influence. They're hiding something, don't tread on me.
The result seems to be the zero-sum game focused almost entirely on attacking the credibility and motives of the other side, rather than engaging in a good-faith debate about the actual data points and the inherent uncertainties.
That certainly characterizes much of the fluoridation debate over the decades. It becomes more about winning the political fight and discrediting the opposition than about collaboratively finding the truth.
And this whole playbook, leveraging anti-authority sentiment, exploiting scientific uncertainty, attacking critics personally, using emotional appeals against institutional science, it feels strikingly identical to what we see playing out in broader contemporary public health and wellness controversies today, doesn't it?
It really is the unifying thread, isn't it? It connects fluoridation to debates around vaccines, GMOs, alternative medicine, and the whole world of modern wellness, or as one of our more critical sources bluntly phrases it, wellness bullshit. These controversies are often personified by figures who gain prominence precisely because they embody this anti-authority, anti-establishment stance, even if their own specific claims sometimes lack rigorous scientific backing.
Right. For example, the source we looked at places Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Mount Rushmore of wellness bullshit.
Yeah, he serves as a powerful contemporary symbol of deep skepticism towards establishment science and government health agencies, particularly regarding vaccines. But his promotion of certain views, like the discredited link between vaccines and autism, is widely deemed pseudoscientific by the overwhelming majority of medical and scientific experts. The controversy around figures like him often gets framed as this binary choice. You're either with the brave anti-establishment truth teller, or you're with the corrupt system.
And on the other side of that binary, you have figures like Dr. Paul Offit, a pediatrician and vaccine developer, who often finds himself characterized by critics in equally stark terms, right, as a sort of archetype of the establishment.
Exactly. Critics often portray Offit as, quote, a noted supporter of big pharma and big chem. He becomes the face of the institutional forces they oppose.
And the critics use these potent historical analogies, comparing the substances these figures defend to known poisons, to really frame them negatively.
Yes. They draw parallels, for example, between fluoride, which opponents consistently call industrial waste, and other historically controversial substances like the pesticide DDT. Critics highlight Offit's stance on DDT, arguing that if Offit had his way, he would bring back the toxic pesticide BDT.
Did he actually advocate bringing DDT back?
Well, Offit has argued, controversially, that the ban on DDT, while well-intentioned, may have had negative consequences, particularly regarding malaria control in developing nations. This leads critics to cite his even more provocative claim that the famed environmentalist Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, which exposed the dangers of DDT, effectively killed millions of people because her book led to the widespread removal of DDT from use, allowing malaria, which DDT helped control, to resurge.
Wow, that's an incredibly charged claim against a figure like Rachel Carson.
It is. But notice the rhetorical effect. It forces the listener into this highly polarized position. Are you with the scientific establishment represented by Offit, seemingly promoting institutional poison like fluoride and maybe even DDT? Or are you with the skeptical advocates like RFK Jr. or the spirit of Rachel Carson, fighting for the people and the environment against these powerful, dangerous forces? It eliminates nuance.
It really feels like the modernized, high-stakes version of the historical snake oil salesman, where celebrity manufactured distrust and appeals to natural purity replace actual scientific evidence.
It shares many elements. Think about the historical precedent described in one source.
Yeah.
The Rattlesnake King, a guy named Clark Stanley back in the late 19th century. His whole scheme relied on these elaborate, completely fake public demonstrations.
What did you do?
He'd apparently have a paid Confederate, a plant, in the audience, hobble onto the stage, pretending to be crippled by rheumatism. Stanley would then dramatically apply his snake oil liniment, and moments later, the plant would leap up, seemingly miraculously cured, and throw his crutches away to the cheers of the crowd. It was pure theater, a visible, tangible demonstration of efficacy, even though it was entirely faked.
Okay, compare that kind of overt theatrical fakery to the strategies used by modern celebrity wellness influencers, like, say, Gwyneth Paltrow and her brand Goop, which is also mentioned in our sources.
Right. Paltrow leveraged her existing Hollywood fame, her aspirational lifestyle image, and considerable marketing savvy to create this high-end luxury wellness brand. Goop is built largely on promoting alternative therapies, supplements, and products that often lack robust scientific backing, positioned as alternatives or complements to mainstream medicine.
And what does the source analysis suggest is the key to Goop's commercial success?
The analysis suggests Goop's success isn't really based on the proven efficacy of its products, but rather on a combination of factors. First, brilliant marketing that taps into anxieties about modern life and distrust of conventional medicine. Second, targeting a demographic that has significant expendable income. And third, perhaps most critically, exploiting what the source rather bluntly calls the underdeveloped critical faculties of its target audience.
That quote about the vaginal jade eggs.
Yeah, the quote that women who will buy vaginal jade eggs will buy pretty much anything is undeniably harsh, maybe even sexist, but it starkly highlights the perceived vulnerability of consumers who are actively seeking alternatives, who desire a sense of control over their health, and who might be willing to suspend critical judgment when a product is packaged with glamour, celebrity endorsement, and promises of natural wellness.
So the common thread running through all these controversies, from the decades-long fight over fluoride to the anti-vaccine movement to the rise of celebrity wellness brands like Goop, seems to be that the public is constantly being asked or challenged to distinguish between a meaningful connection or cause and effect relationship and what might just be pure random coincidence or correlation without causation. This challenge seems absolutely critical for developing skepticism.
It really is the ultimate test of critical thinking in the modern information age, isn't it? And there's a phenomenal example of this challenge discussed in one of the skeptical sources. The Chelyabinsk meteor event in Russia back on February 15, 2013.
I remember that. The dash cam videos were incredible. What was the coincidence?
The truly mind-boggling coincidence was that on that exact same day, February 15, 2013, a completely separate, unrelated, and much larger asteroid, designated 2012 DA14, made an extraordinarily close flyby of Earth. It passed just 28,000 kilometers, about 17,000 miles, above the surface that's actually well inside the ring of geostationary satellites. An incredibly close shave in astronomical terms.
Wow. Okay, so you have a significant meteor exploding over Russia, injuring hundreds of people, and on the very same day, a completely different asteroid makes one of the closest recorded passes of Earth. To the untrained eye, or maybe even the trained eye initially, they must be related somehow, right?
Exactly. That was the immediate assumption by many people and even some initial media reports. The speculation was rampant. Was the Chelyabinsk meteor a smaller piece that broke off DA14? Was it traveling with the asteroid? Did the asteroid's gravitational pull somehow perturb its orbit and cause it to hit Earth? It seemed too incredible to be mere coincidence.
But the scientific data showed otherwise.
Unequivocally. Orbital analysis quickly showed that the Chelyabinsk meteoroid came from a completely different part of the asteroid belt, was traveling on a totally different trajectory in orbit, and had absolutely no physical relationship to the flyby asteroid 2012 DA14. It was just pure, magnificent, astronomical coincidence. Two rare, high-profile astronomical events happened to occur on the same calendar day.
So how does this perfectly illustrate the fundamental flaw in human perception when it comes to probability and patterns?
It shows that we humans are generally quite terrible at intuitively assessing the true probability of seemingly unlikely events occurring randomly. The challenge for the skeptic, the critical thinker, is realizing that, as the saying goes, unlikely things happen all the time, especially when there are billions of people and countless events happening every single day across the planet and in the solar system. Our perceived probability of a coincidence is drastically affected by how we frame the question, by what statisticians sometimes call cherry-picking the data or defining the boundaries of the statistical box we're looking at.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that statistical box analogy? How does framing change the odds?
Sure, if you ask a very, very narrow, specific question after the events has already happened, the odds look astronomical. For instance, what were the odds that a 20-meter diameter asteroid would explode over the specific city of Chelyabinsk, Russia, and a completely unrelated 30-meter diameter asteroid would pass within 30,000 kilometers of Earth, both happening on the exact date of February 15, 2013? The answer to that post hoc question is ridiculously, vanishingly small.
Right, because you've defined the box extremely narrowly just to include the specific events you already observed.
Precisely. That's cherry-picking the coordinates in time and space. But if you broaden the scope of the question beforehand, or even just consider a wider time frame, the odds change dramatically. What if you ask, what are the chances that any sort of newsworthy, potentially related seeming astronomical event, like a significant meteor or close asteroid flyby, maybe a bright comet, occurs on the same day as any other significant terrestrial event, like a major earthquake, a volcanic eruption, a tsunami, within, say, a 15-year window of historical observation? Suddenly, the probability becomes quite high, maybe even close to certainty.
Because there are lots of those kinds of events happening fairly regularly around the world and in near Earth space.
Exactly. We have large bolides, fireballs,
Yeah.
entering the atmosphere frequently. We have numerous near-Earth asteroids making close passes. And we certainly have plenty of earthquakes and other natural disasters happening all the time. We just don't notice most of them, or we don't perceive a connection unless two happen to align in a way that fits the pattern we're already looking for or primed to see, like a shared date suggesting a shared trajectory, or a temporal cluster suggesting a hidden, deeper connection or cause. We're pattern-seeking animals, even when the pattern is just random noise.
And when people fail to apply that kind of skeptical lens, when they assume a meaningful connection where there is only coincidence or correlation, the harm can move from being just a philosophical error to something absolutely critical, even life-threatening. The acceptance of pseudoscience based on faulty pattern recognition or misplaced trust can have devastating real-world consequences.
Financially and physically devastating, absolutely. Just consider the case, mentioned in the sources, of James McCormick, a British businessman. He was convicted back in 2013 for fraud on a massive scale. What was he selling? Fake bomb detectors.
Fake bomb detectors? How fake?
Completely fake. They were essentially based on cheap $20 novelty golf ball finders, the kind with the swiveling antenna on a handle. He repackaged them, gave them a techno-sounding name like the ADE 651, claimed they could detect explosives, drugs, even ivory from hundreds of meters away with no power source needed. And he sold millions of dollars worth of this completely bogus technology. Reports mention figures up to $75 million, primarily to security forces in Iraq and other conflict zones like Georgia and Niger.
That's horrifying. The harm there is immediate and potentially lethal. You have people, soldiers, or police relying on a useless piece of plastic that looks vaguely scientific to determine if a car contains a bomb or if an area is safe to enter. People likely died because of this fraud.
Almost certainly. It's a stark example of how accepting pseudoscience, believing in something that doesn't work because it looks like it should or because someone authoritative sells it convincingly, can have the most dire consequences imaginable.
And in the wellness or medical space, the harm, while maybe less immediately dramatic than a bomb, often impacts incredibly vulnerable people, those searching desperately for closure after a tragedy, or grasping for any hope of a cure for a serious illness. The long history of psychics and mediums seems to illustrate this kind of ethical failure perfectly.
It really does. Psychics often prey on grief and desperation, offering answers and connections that science cannot provide. But their failures, when documented, can be devastatingly cruel.
Can you give us a specific, particularly memorable example of a psychic failure that's highlighted in the sources?
Sylvia Browne is probably the most famous or infamous modern example. Despite a very long history of well-documented failures and incorrect predictions, she maintained a massive public platform for decades, including frequent appearances on popular TV shows like Montel Williams.
And what was one of her most notable failures?
One particularly heartbreaking case involved the kidnapping of Amanda Berry in Cleveland, Ohio. In 2004, about a year after Berry disappeared, Brown appeared on the Montel Williams show with Berry's grieving mother, Luana Miller. Brown looked Miller in the eye and told her with absolute certainty that her daughter Amanda was dead. She said flatly, "She's not alive, honey." She even added details about her being in water.
Oh my God, what happened then?
Amanda Berry's mother reportedly returned home, devastated, took down the posters of her missing daughter, and died just 2 years later, apparently believing her child was gone forever. But as the world later learned, Amanda Berry was very much alive. She, along with two other women, was eventually found in 2013, having been held captive just a few miles away from her home for nearly a decade. Brown was completely, tragically wrong.
That is just immense cruelty, isn't it? Offering false certainty that destroys hope, all disguised as some kind of spiritual authority or gift.
And it wasn't an isolated incident for Brown. The sources mentioned an eerily similar situation back in 2002 involving another missing child, Sean Hornbeck from Missouri. Brown told his parents, again on national television, that their son was dead. She even gave specific, vivid details. She said he would be found deceased in a wooded area near two large, jagged boulders, and that he had been taken by a tall, dark-skinned man, possibly Hispanic, with dreadlocks.
And what was the reality in that case?
5 years later, in 2007, Sean Hornbeck was found very much alive. He'd been kidnapped and held captive by a white man named Michael Devlin, who has short hair and certainly no dreadlocks. Hornbeck was found in Devlin's suburban apartment, not in a wooded area near boulders. Literally every single specific detail of Brown's psychic vision, the status of the child, the location, the description of the kidnapper, was demonstrably completely wrong.
These documented failures really underscore the massive human stakes involved when emotional narratives, wishful thinking, or claims of special insight are allowed to override verifiable evidence and critical thinking. Which brings us, I suppose, full circle back to the ongoing public health controversies, like the debate around vaccines, which seems to share so many of the same rhetorical elements and psychological dynamics as the fluoridation controversy.
Absolutely. The vaccine controversy, particularly the persistent, though scientifically debunked, alleged link between childhood vaccines and autism, is arguably the highest profile current example of this tension between scientific consensus and public skepticism fueled by anecdote, fear, and distrust of authority. And just like with fluoride, despite overwhelming scientific evidence from numerous large-scale studies showing that vaccines and autism are not causally related, claims for compensation and challenges to vaccine mandates continue to challenge public health integrity.
And much of this is playing out, as mentioned in the sources, in a specific legal forum in the U.S. known as the Autism Omnibus Proceedings within the Court of Federal Claims. Why is this specific court involved? What is it?
Right, the Vaccine Court, as it's informally known, or more formally the Office of Special Masters of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, was set up by the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. Its purpose was actually to create a no-fault system to compensate individuals who could demonstrate they had suffered a genuine injury as a result of a mandated childhood vaccine. The idea was to stabilize the vaccine market, which was threatened by lawsuits, while still providing a fair process for those rare cases of actual vaccine injury.
So it wasn't originally intended to be a venue for proving or disproving broad theories like whether vaccines cause autism?
Not exactly. But starting in the early 2000s, thousands of families began filing petitions to the vaccine court, claiming that vaccines, particularly the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or vaccines containing the preservative thimerosal, had caused their children's autism. Due to the sheer volume, over 5,000 petitions, the court decided to consolidate them into the Autism Omnibus Proceeding, AOP. They selected a small number of test cases to hear evidence on several different theories of how vaccines might allegedly cause autism.
And what was the outcome of those test cases?
After extensive hearings reviewing thousands of scientific documents and hearing testimony from experts on both sides, the special masters in the vaccine court issued rulings decisively rejecting all the major theories linking vaccines to autism. They found the evidence simply wasn't there to support a causal connection.
So the legal outcome aligned with the scientific consensus.
Yes. But the very existence of the proceedings and the fact that petitioners continue to pursue these claims despite the overwhelming contrary scientific evidence highlights the power of parental testimony, anecdotal evidence, and the persistent belief in a link, often fueled by anti-vaccine activists and alternative health practitioners. It shows how difficult it is to counter deeply held beliefs with just scientific data, especially when dealing with something as complex and emotionally charged as autism.
And the scientific community's stance on the perceived epidemic of autism remains firm, doesn't it? That it's not a real epidemic caused by some external factor like vaccines.
Completely firm, yes. The sources reiterate the mainstream scientific understanding. The dramatic rise in autism diagnoses over the past few decades is largely, if not entirely, an artifact of two main factors. First, a significant broadening of the diagnostic criteria under the umbrella term autism spectrum disorder, ASD, which now includes many individuals who in the past might have been diagnosed simply as having intellectual disabilities, learning disorders, or perhaps even childhood schizophrenia. And second, greatly increased surveillance, awareness, and screening for autism by parents, pediatricians, and schools.
So basically, we're just much better at identifying and diagnosing it across a wider spectrum than we used to be. There isn't some hidden environmental cause like vaccines triggering a massive new plague.
That is the overwhelming scientific consensus. There is no evidence of a hidden plague caused by vaccines. There is primarily evidence of better identification and changing diagnostic practices. But again, countering the emotionally compelling narrative of an epidemic caused by a specific exposure is incredibly challenging in the public sphere.
Okay, so after this really intense and quite detailed look into the history and dynamics of the fluoridation debate, and drawing these parallels with other challenging public health and pseudoscience controversies, what are the final big picture lessons we should take away from this deep dive?
Well, I think we have to zoom out one last time and really recognize the central tension that defines this whole conflict. This deep dive has clearly shown, I think, that the fluoride debate isn't just one thing. It's a battle that has been fought and continues to be fought simultaneously on at least four major, often completely inseparable fronts.
Okay, what are those four fronts?
First, there's the ongoing debate about the scientific validity, the actual size and certainty of the original benefit estimates, especially in the modern era of widespread toothpaste use, and the ongoing questions about safety, particularly the potential for systemic effects like IQ reduction or more than cosmetic fluorosis. That's the science front. Second, there's the fundamental ethical dilemma. The clash between the public health goal of preventing disease across a population and the principle of individual autonomy, framed most powerfully by opponents as the compulsory mass medication argument, versus the proponents' view of it as a standard public health measure like chlorination. That's the ethical front.
Makes sense.
Third is the inescapable political dimension. This involves questions about government authority versus individual liberty, trust in experts and institutions, the influence of alleged corporate interests, like the aluminum industry narrative, and the effectiveness of grassroots activism versus centralized public health campaigns. That's the political front.
And the fourth front.
And finally, perhaps underpinning all the others, is the deep psychological front. This involves our cognitive biases, like confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance, our susceptibility to emotional reasoning over analytical thinking when faced with complex or threatening information, our need for certainty, and our powerful tribal instincts to defend our group's beliefs and attack the credibility of outsiders.
It really seems like those power dynamics are just inescapable throughout this story. The struggle over scientific knowledge, or what counts as knowledge, cannot be cleanly separated from the struggle over who controls the narrative, right? Who has the resources to fund and conduct the research? Who controls the prestigious professional journals where findings are published or suppressed? And who holds the political power and media access to effectively silence or discredit the opposition? All of that seems just as important, maybe even more important in practice than the raw data itself.
I think that's a key takeaway. What's particularly fascinating and maybe frustrating about the fluoridation debate is how often the areas of genuine scientific uncertainty, like what is the precise magnitude of fluoride's benefit today, now that fluoride toothpaste is everywhere? Or what is the real prevalence and significance of non-lethal side effects like dental fluorosis, which clearly bothers some people aesthetically? It's precisely those gray areas, that inherent scientific uncertainty, that gets amplified and weaponized.
How so? Weaponized by whom?
It gets seized upon by ideological or financial interests on both sides, and often transformed into these absolute, binary, highly sensationalized public debates. It becomes miracle cure versus deadly poison, or sound science versus evil conspiracy. the nuance gets lost.
And the human brain, as we discussed, generally loves simplicity and emotionally resonant stories far more than it loves grappling with complex, nuanced, uncertain data. So we're quick to adopt that binary choice that's offered to us.
Exactly. Which might help explain why, as our sources note, the core arguments and the fundamental battle lines on both sides of the fluoridation debate have not really changed all that dramatically since the 1940s and 50s. This is despite 8 decades of continuous research, thousands of studies, and countless reviews.
That's a really striking point. The arguments for and against fluoridation proponents focusing on a cheap, passive, massive public good for dental health, opponents focusing on violations of purity, consent, and the risks of forced ingestion of a poison have remained remarkably consistent over time. Even as the scientific details have evolved, the fundamental clash of worldviews seems stuck.
It does seem remarkably persistent, suggesting that the debate is perhaps driven more by underlying values and beliefs about government science and risk than by the specific scientific evidence itself, which is always evolving and always open to interpretation to some degree.
So, given that remarkable persistence, we'd like to leave you, our listeners, with this provocative question to ponder. If the core arguments for and against water fluoridation have remained essentially the same since the 1940s, despite decades upon decades of research, does the sheer endurance of this debate tell us more about the chemical substance in the water itself? Or does it tell us more about the fundamental organization of modern society, the nature of scientific authority, and the enduring quirks of human psychology?
Something to think about, definitely, as you continue your own learning journey through complex issues where science and society collide.
Thank you so much for joining us for this very intense look into the water we drink and the debates that surround it. We hope you found it illuminating. We'll see you on the next deep dive.